London, 1861. Morning light spilled over Hyde Park like molten gold, making the mist shimmer in a translucent veil. Silent, fragile, belonging only to those uncertain hours between night and day. Lady Cecily Grant rode along the most secluded stretch of Rotten Row with the ease of someone raised between saddle and stirrup. She dared speeds no respectable lady would ever confess to. Here, far from carriages and sharper tongues, she breathed as she pleased, free. But she had not come only to ride. She had come to meet those society preferred not to see, perhaps because deep down she still recognized in them echoes of someone she had lost long ago. Her maid waited near the side gate, a discreet corner where no member of the elite would pass so early. The girl's eyes were red. The crumpled letter in her hand trembled so violently it seemed ready to dissolve, as if her courage itself depended on that single sheet of paper. Cecily dismounted and listened in silence. Withheld wages, veiled humiliations, the threat of dismissal without references, a blow capable of ruining a young woman's life. "I'll speak for you," Cecily promised, touching her shoulder with the tenderness of someone who understands the weight of her own vow. "They won't condemn you without hearing your truth." The girl disappeared among the trees, and Cecily turned back to her mare. A sudden wind swept across the park, too cold for that hour. Her horse flicked its ears uneasy. The birds seemed to fall silent all at once, a stillness so thick it made Cecily pause mid-step. Then came the whistle. Sharp, swift, wrong. She lifted her head. Among the damp shadows of the trees, something flashed. A metallic glint, precise and unyielding. The barrel of a pocket pistol aimed straight at her chest. Cecily's heart missed its beat. If this story touched you in any way, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps bring new chapters to life. And tell me in the comments, from which city and country are you watching? I love seeing how far our stories travel. Cecily Grant had been raised to be an ornament. Daughter of the Earl of Elmsford, she grew up among gaslit balls, French silk and rules of etiquette as rigid as the corset she had worn since childhood. She learned to smile when smiles were expected, to keep silent when silence was required, to take her place as yet another elegant piece of aristocratic decor. But beneath the silk and obedience, something in her had never fully accepted that gilded cage. Perhaps the fault lay in the books she read in secret. Essays on women's rights, accounts by abolitionists, letters from missionaries describing miseries as distant from London's splendor as the moon. Or perhaps it was simply her nature, restless and fervent, carefully wrapped in gentleness, the only armor acceptable for a lady. Ever since the night a young maid had been dismissed without warning, without references, and without her final pay, Cecily had never again looked at the glittering salons with the same innocence. At 16, she found in her morning rides a convenient shield. While she rode through Hyde Park with the impeccable composure expected of a lady, she quietly began work no one in her family would ever approve. It started with a timid gesture. A coin slipped into the hand of a wounded soldier, a letter written in secret for a wronged maid. Then others followed. A sick child seen by a doctor who owed her a favor. A young man spared from forced enlistment through the plea of a lawyer she had persuaded to intervene. Over the years, these isolated threads wove themselves into a silent network of aid. Lawyers indebted to the Grants, physicians willing to treat without charge, influential ladies capable of interceding without their names ever being spoken, all of them, in one way or another, crossed Cecily's path. She learned to listen to the whispered stories carried through kitchens, corridors, and parks, to use the discreet weight of her family name as both key and shield. But in the world she lived in, even charity had invisible boundaries. There were causes that could soften the hearts of drawing rooms, and others that made powerful hands curl into fists. And when a young lady began to move along that thin dividing line, polite smiles could hide something far less gentle. Somewhere between compassion and recklessness, someone began to see her not as a harmless figure, but as a threat, a face far too lovely to shelter such inconvenient ideas. At first it was nothing more than lingering looks, a cold remark at a ball, an anonymous letter slipped beneath a door. Then came the silence. And silence, Cecily would learn, was always the most dangerous warning. And that June morning, beneath the soft, deceptively innocent light of London's most elegant park, that someone finally sent a message, a messenger of lead. The bullet never reached her. There was only a sudden noise to her left, a shift of air, a flash too quick for her eyes to catch. And then, before she could even draw breath, the body of a man hurled itself in front of her, placing himself between the trigger and her heart. Chapter 1. The Weight of Silence. Cecily didn't scream. The shock stole her breath before fear could even find a voice. The world seemed to split into slow, fragile layers, the metallic flash between the trees, the muffled crack tearing through the stillness of morning, her horse arching its neck in panic. Something cut through the air at her left, not a sound but a movement, too swift to comprehend, too instinctive to truly see, and then a body crossed her line of vision. He hadn't come from nowhere. He must have been walking along the side path like so many early rising gentlemen. Yet in that moment, caught between mist and golden light, he seemed to materialize from the air itself. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in impeccable black, he moved with the precision of someone who recognized the sound of a gunshot before it had even finished echoing. He hurled himself between her and the danger with brutal resolve. The impact spun him around. He staggered 2 unsteady steps as if his body fought to hold on to dignity through sheer discipline before he dropped to his knees and collapsed onto the gravel. Cecily ran to him, kneeling before she even realized she'd let go of the reins. His face turned toward the light and she knew him instantly. Gabriel Fitzroy, the Duke of Hereford, the most austere, impenetrable man in London, had just thrown himself into the path of a bullet meant for her. "Your Grace," Cecily's voice trembled. Her white gloves slid over his coat, searching for the source of the warm blood seeping through the wool. "Don't move." "I'll fetch help." "No." The word came rough, edged with an iron that had weathered years. Gabriel opened his eyes, dark, intense, assessing the world, even through pain. "Leave, before he fires again." "I won't leave you. Lady Cecily." The way he said her name, authority cloaked in urgency, stilled her heartbeat. It was a warning. She should step back. But she didn't. "I won't abandon you," she whispered, pressing the wound. "Stay still, please." His jaw tightened, discipline warring with pain. For a moment he looked ready to argue, the old unyielding duke rising in defiance. But then, with the smallest shift, he nodded. 1 inch of surrender. It was all she needed. Voices rose in the distance. Footsteps rushed across the quiet park. A guard appeared, followed by 2 alarmed gentlemen. Moments later, ladies with parasols and curious servants gathered, forming a hesitant semicircle. "What happened here?" the guard asked, breathless. "Your Grace?" "Good heavens!" "There was a shot," Cecily said. Her voice was so calm it felt detached from her own body. "I heard the sound and saw him fall." "An assault? In Hyde Park?" one gentleman muttered, pale. "I don't know," she replied. "I didn't see anyone." The lie dropped like a stone, but the truth here would be far more dangerous. Gabriel opened his eyes and met hers. He knew, and she knew he knew. But the silence between them was the only protection they had. More people arrived. They sent for a doctor. Someone else ran to fetch the Duke's carriage. Cecily stayed kneeling, applying pressure to the wound, feeling his blood creeping warm across her wrists. "Why did you do that?" she whispered. "Why step in front of it?" Gabriel took a moment to answer. When he spoke, it was barely a breath. "Because I saw him in the shadows of the trees." "You saw the man?" "Yes. And I saw the moment he raised the pistol at you, waiting for his chance." The words fell between them like lead. Cecily's stomach twisted. He wasn't guessing, he knew. The Duke's carriage arrived at full speed. Servants and his butler descended, lifting Gabriel with trained precision. He stifled a groan but didn't protest, iron discipline holding his body upright. Cecily finally stepped back. Her hands were red to the wrists, the lace of her gloves ruined. Her pale morning gown, meant for elegance, now looked as if it belonged on a battlefield. "Lady Cecily," the butler said gently, We must take you home. It isn't safe." "I'm fine," she steadied her voice. "See to him. He needs a doctor." "One has already been summoned, but your family will be worried." Cecily glanced at her blood-stained dress as if it belonged to someone else. "I can ride back." "No." The word sliced through the air. Gabriel, leaning against the carriage, was breathing hard, yet still capable of commanding the world around him. His gaze locked onto hers with an intensity that forced her to swallow. "Take her home. Now." He inhaled sharply, pain threading through the movement. "And station guards at the Grants' residence." The butler nodded. Cecily opened her mouth to protest, but Gabriel looked at her again, and in his eyes she saw something she had never seen in him before. Vulnerability. Not fear for himself, fear for her. "Please," he murmured, "go home, and stay there." The plea, simple, urgent, human, broke through every argument. A servant guided her to the second carriage. Cecily stepped inside, her hands resting still in her lap, still marked with his blood. Through the window she watched the Duke's carriage depart first, swift, disappearing into the trees. Hyde Park remained beautiful. Golden light filtered through the branches. Birds sang, unbothered. But something had changed, deeply. This was not an ending. It was only the beginning. And Gabriel Fitzroy, the Duke of Harrowford, the most untouchable man in London, was now bound to her by blood, by silence, and by a bullet that never should have existed. Chapter 2. Ghosts of War. Gabriel woke first to the smell, ether tangled with the iron tang of his own blood, and only then to the pain. It came as a living pulse, throbbing from shoulder to chest, marking time with cruel precision. It wasn't a new pain. It carried the old texture of Crimean nights, of shots that dragged him from sleep long before his mind could understand the danger. He had become a soldier because he'd been born the second son, a destiny plain, almost comfortable. The military had fit him like a well-cut uniform. Discipline, hierarchy, purpose. He had never imagined another life. But when his elder brother succumbed to typhoid fever, London claimed him back, thrusting upon him a dukedom he had never wished to inherit. Since then, he lived divided between two existences, the life he had chosen and the life duty had forced upon him. With effort, he opened his eyes. The dim room reflected him in the mirror atop the bedside table, hair too dark to be truly brown, falling in loose waves with one rebellious strand that always dropped across his brow, eyes a deep, shadowed brown, almost black, marked by too many restless nights, features carved by years outdoors, an austere jaw, a firm chin, thick brows that lent him a naturally severe expression. War had made him leaner but never less solid. His body held a contained strength, the sort that wasn't displayed but used only when needed. A duke with a soldier's bearing. Or perhaps a soldier condemned to look like a duke. He remained still for several seconds, breathing slowly. Linen sheets, a firm mattress, thick bandages binding shoulder and ribs. He was home, and alive. "Welcome back, Your Grace." The dry, almost ironic voice of Dr. Langley cut through the heavy air of the room. Gabriel opened his eyes wider. The heavy drapes filtered the afternoon light into bluish shadows. 2 candles burned on the dresser, casting trembling reflections over recently cleaned surgical instruments. "You were unconscious for a few hours," the physician said, a middle-aged man with steady hands and a clinical gaze. "The bullet passed cleanly through near the shoulder, but far too close to the artery. I would prefer not to repeat that kind of surgery." Gabriel tried to sit. The world wavered for a heartbeat, before settling back into place. "Still," Langley ordered, raising a hand, "unless you wish to undo my work and face my irritation, which many claim is worse than the pain." "What time is it?" Gabriel's voice came out hoarse, scraping his throat like coarse sand. "A little past 3 in the afternoon. You lost enough blood to topple a horse. Complete rest." "I can't rest." "You can, if you want that arm to keep working." Langley snapped his leather case shut. "Anasidi, why was a duke in Hyde Park at the 1 hour when no respectable soul wanders there?" Gabriel stared at the ceiling. The truth was simple. He needed the mornings. He needed the quiet before the city woke. The cold air to steady his mind, the routine that kept him from sinking into memories of battlefields. But he told no one that. "I like to ride early." "Ah," the doctor tilted his head. "And throwing yourself in front of bullets, is that also part of your morning exercise?" Gabriel almost smiled. Almost. "No." "Then I assume it was intentional." "It was necessary." Langley studied him for a long moment, eyes speaking far more than his mouth. "Was the young lady truly in danger?" "Yes." "And you know her?" The question pierced the room like a subtle blade. "Know her?" "No." But in that moment at the park, her pale hair, the tension in her profile, the compassion he had witnessed as she comforted the crying maid, something about her had caught his attention in a way that made no sense. He had seen countless ladies, countless seasons, countless perfect smiles, but never that expression, sincere, solemn, wounded by injustices that did not even touch her directly. And then he had seen the man in the shadows watching her, then the metallic glint between the trees, the angle of the aim, the intention. The soldier in him had done the rest, move before thinking, interpose before measuring consequences. "I know Lady Cecily only from balls," he said at last, "but no one deserves to die like that." Langley rose. "Prepare yourself, then. This story will not vanish quietly. Society devours scandals like this. I didn't do it for gossip. And yet gossip will come." The doctor headed for the door. "And I doubt Lady Cecily Grant will simply thank you and walk away. Young ladies rarely do." The door closed behind him with a soft, final click. Gabriel lay motionless, listening to a distant clock ticking somewhere down the corridor. The pain in his shoulder dulled into a heavy, steady beat, almost familiar. Langley was right. It was a social disaster. Dukes did not bleed in public. They did not get involved in shootings. They did not save young ladies they barely knew, especially young ladies who were beautiful, very beautiful, and watched by all of London. But there was something worse than disturbing the customs of the aristocracy, disturbing the invisible laws of war. The shot that had tried to kill Cecily hadn't been amateur. It had been precise, cold, professional, a warning, or the beginning of something larger. And if he, trained reflexes or not, hadn't seen that glint of metal in the shadows. If he had been just 1 second farther, Gabriel closed his eyes. The image rose again with cruel clarity, Cecily lifting her face, blue eyes widening in shock, her horse recoiling with a frightened cry. If that bullet had reached her, he inhaled sharply, cutting the thought short. The decision was already made. He pulled the silk cord beside his bed. Minutes later, the familiar, slightly dragging step of Whitmore echoed down the corridor, a reminder that years ago Gabriel had been the only man to offer him dignified employment despite his injury. And Whitmore had served him ever since, with the quiet loyalty of someone who understands the value of a second chance. "You called, Your Grace." "I need information." Whitmore waited, silent. "Lady Cecily Grant. I want everything you can find, discreetly." "Yes, sir." A pause. "But I should tell you something first." "Go on." 3 notes arrived from the Grant residence. "The Earl wishes to visit as soon as Your Grace permits. It seems Lady Cecily insisted." Something tightened in Gabriel's chest, an echo of something he could not name. Not discomfort, not duty. Something more subtle, impossible to define. "I will receive the Earl tomorrow, in the morning." Whitmore nodded. "And Whitmore?" "Yes, Your Grace?" "I want trusted men watching the Grant Street. Nothing conspicuous, just attentive eyes. They're already in place." A faint smile touched Whitmore's lips, the brief smile of a man who anticipated the order long before he heard it. "I imagined you would ask." He left with his distinct gait. Alone again, Gabriel eased back onto the mattress, his shoulder protesting in warm, sharp waves. But the pain was no longer the point. What pursued him were the questions. Why would anyone target a young aristocratic lady? Who stood to gain from her death? And why did she, gentle, discreet, quietly defiant, seemed to carry the weight of others' suffering as if it were her own. Those questions followed him until exhaustion finally claimed him, and when sleep came, it brought no rest. It brought muddy trenches, shots echoing through fog, and at the center of it all, like a sudden flare of light, the blue eyes of Lady Cecily Grant, unexpected, wounded, and impossible to forget. Chapter 3. Under Watch. Cecily couldn't stop looking at her own hands. They were clean, pale skin, slender fingers, soft pink nails, and yet every time she glanced at them she still saw the insistent red that was no longer there. She had washed them 3 times, first with cold water, then with the housekeeper's harsh soap, and finally with vinegar that stung her skin. Still, she felt the blood, the thick warmth, the weight. Gabriel Fitzroy's blood. A duke, a soldier. A man who had thrown himself into the path of a bullet meant for her. Lady Cecily? She lifted her head. Mary, the maid, stood at the doorway, hands twisting nervously in her apron. "Your mother asks for you in the sitting room, immediately." Of course she did. Ever since Cecily had returned home, exhausted, skirt ruined, gloves stained a violent red, her mother had swung between panic and aristocratic composure. There had been tea laced with laudanum, the family doctor examining her with eyes far too clinical, questions repeated until they pricked like needles. What happened? Who was there? Are you hurt? Cecily had answered with half-truths. The park, the gunshot, the Duke falling. Nothing about the pistol aimed squarely at her chest. Nothing about her quiet network of charity. Nothing about the simple truth that the shot hadn't been an accident. "I'll come at once," she murmured. She smoothed the pale blue skirt, simple, modest, so different from the boldness of her secret actions, and pinned her hair into a flawless knot. The mirror reflected a composed young lady, fair and neat. A perfect mask. Beneath it, her heart beat fast, as if she were still kneeling in the gravel of Hyde Park. In the corridor, 2 maids stopped whispering the moment she passed. On the stairs, a footman pretended not to watch her, though his gaze followed her every movement. For the first time, Cecily felt her own home closing in around her. The sitting room glowed with soft morning light. Lady Elmsford sat perfectly upright, immaculate despite the shadows beneath her powder-dusted eyes. Near the fireplace, the Earl stood rigid, arms crossed. "We've had word from Harrowford House," he said without preamble. "The Duke is recovering. The bullet passed through without causing lasting damage." Cecily closed her eyes for a breath. Air finally seemed to return to her lungs. "Thank God," she whispered. "He will receive us this morning," her father continued. "We are to thank him in person." "We?" The word slipped out before she could stop it. "Naturally you will come with us," Lady Elmsford replied. "It would be unthinkable not to thank the man who saved your life." Part of her wanted to see him, to be certain he was breathing, that his sacrifice had not been in vain. Another part feared what she might find in his eyes, what he might expect in return. "There is also a complication." The Earl exchanged a tense glance with his wife. "The city is talking about the incident." "Talking?" Cecily felt her throat tighten. "The Duke of Harrowford, wounded while protecting you, under circumstances no one understand," her mother sighed delicately. "Half of London is already whispering." "Whispering what?" The question came out sharper than she intended. "Anything they can," her father replied bitterly. "About you being alone, about him appearing at the precise moment, about the reason for the shot. The imagination of London is a dangerous enemy." Heat rushed to Cecily's cheeks. "I barely know His Grace," she protested softly. "We know," her mother said gently, though her voice held iron. "But society doesn't care for what is true, only for what is interesting." Her father straightened. "Your visit today will help contain the rumors. We'll be formal, brief. We express gratitude, insist it was an unfortunate accident, and after that—" He paused. "You will remain at home for a few weeks." It wasn't said as a punishment, yet it struck like a sentence. No outings, no Hyde Park, no quiet work on behalf of the powerless, no search for who wanted her dead. "I understand," she said, a lie. Because even as she spoke, she was already planning otherwise. Harrowford House rose over Grosvenor Square like a monument of pale stone and silent authority. Cecily had passed by many times, yet never truly noticed it. The Doric columns guarding the entrance, the polished bronze door handles, the tall, impeccably aligned windows like watchful eyes that saw everything and forgot nothing. This morning, it all felt larger, sterner, as if the house, like its owner, were judging whether she belonged inside at all. The door opened before they could knock. A tall butler, posture razor straight, bowed. "Lord Elmsford, Lady Elmsford, Lady Cecily. His Grace awaits you in the library." They crossed the marble hall, their footsteps echoing as if the very silence were listening. Up the grand staircase they went, each step giving Cecily the sense of entering a world never meant for her. The library was wide, its mahogany shelves rising nearly to the ceiling. Light filtered through high windows, washing over Persian carpets and leather chairs. But Cecily saw none of it. Not really. Her gaze fixed on the figure standing near the unlit fireplace. Gabriel Fitzroy looked pale, yet immovably composed. He wore a charcoal waistcoat, a spotless shirt, and a perfectly tied cravat. His left arm rested in a silk sling. Shadows pooled beneath his eyes, not only from pain but from unquiet nights, yet his posture remained unshakable, as though nothing in the world could truly unsettle him. He inclined his head. "Lord Elmsford, Lady Elmsford." "Lady Cecily." Her father offered firm, measured thanks. Her mother grew emotional, her voice trembling only as much as etiquette allowed. Gabriel looked away, as if praise bothered him more than injury. Cecily stood slightly behind them, hands tingling. "How is your shoulder, Your Grace?" she managed. His gaze landed on her. It was the sort of look that examined, weighed, and seemed to see layers others never noticed. "Sore," he admitted. "But Dr. Langley has forbidden duels and weightlifting." A ghost of a smile touched his mouth. "London is safe, for the moment." Cecily blinked, caught off guard. She hadn't expected humour. Warmth, grateful, startled, something quieter, spread through her chest. They spoke little, all of them moving within strict boundaries of decorum. Her father spoke of gratitude, her mother spoke of prayers. Gabriel replied with polite formality that anyone else would mistake for coldness. But Cecily saw what others didn't. She noticed the faint tremor in his hand when he adjusted his cravat, the way his breath tightened when he shifted, the careful stiffness of his injured shoulder, as though he were constantly calculating how not to reveal weakness. He kept secrets, just as she did. When the formalities ended, the Earl stepped back. "We won't take more of your time, Harrowford. We only wish for your swift recovery." "Recovering is the least I owe Lady Cecily," he said simply. Cecily met his eyes. Just for a second, but it felt long, far too long. She parted her lips, almost said it was meant for me or someone wants me dead, but the words died before she could breathe them. With her parents only steps away, with walls that seemed to hold their own counsel, there was no truth she could safely speak. They exchanged courteous goodbyes, but as she turned to leave, Cecily couldn't resist glancing back. Gabriel still stood near the window, half veiled by the curtain's shadow. He was not the distant duke of ballroom gossip. There was something watchful in him now, taut and alert, as if he were tracking the Elmsfords' every step down the stairs. And in that moment, Cecily's heart quickened, and she knew with a cold clarity creeping from her feet to her chest that this was far from over. Not for him, and certainly not for her. Someone had tried to kill her. And Gabriel Fitzroy, Duke of Harrowford, the most untouchable man in London, had decided, for reasons she could not yet fathom, to place her under his vigilance and his protection, whether Cecily welcomed it or not. Chapter 4. Silent Protector. Gabriel knew he was making a mistake, the kind a duke would never admit aloud, but a soldier recognized at once. He'd known it from the moment he left his bed 2 days after the shot, long before the doctor had allowed it. In the days that followed, he'd spent more time standing than lying down, more time in the streets and in the park than in Harrowford House. He knew it when he ignored the sharp stab in his shoulder to shrug into his coat. He knew it when he ordered his horse saddled and rode toward Hyde Park at first light, every jolt waking the dull throb beneath the sling. And he knew it most of all now, standing among the trees near the east gate, hidden in the half-shadow, waiting to see whether Lady Cecily Grant would dare disobey her father. It was an invasion of privacy. It was behavior unworthy of a duke. It was, as Whitmore had remarked the night before, a kind of stubbornness that borders on obsession, Your Grace. But Gabriel could not stop. The last few days had been a sequence of careful steps and cautious questions. He moved with the same precision he used to manage a dukedom and to keep certain memories of Crimea buried. He had uncovered more than polite society would ever admit. Lady Cecily Grant had a second life. She was not merely the soft-eyed debutante the ballrooms fawned over. She was, in the eyes of many, something dangerously subversive wrapped in silk and polished smiles. Gabriel had returned to the site of the shooting 2 mornings after the attack, with the sun still low. At first glance, the park looked undisturbed, cropped grass, a neat gravel path, the same well-bred quiet. But near the trees, a little apart from the main track, the ground told another story. A boot mark, almost erased by damp. A low branch broken at exactly the height needed for a steady rest. 3 crushed straw cigarette ends in a patch of earth where no respectable man had any reason to loiter. It wasn't much, but it was enough to see a pattern. The shooter knew the ground, knew the routine. He had prepared this, calmly, methodically. He knew Cecily passed that way. He knew she rode alone. He knew she stopped, regularly, to speak to people others pretended not to see. It hadn't been a clumsy attempt. It had been a planned execution, and Gabriel needed to know who had reason to wish death on a young woman half of London still insisted on calling an ornament. The sky was just beginning to pale when he heard it. Hooves on gravel, a controlled rhythm. Gabriel stepped back deeper into the trees, bracing himself against a nearby trunk. His shoulder flared with hot pain. For a moment, his vision dimmed at the edges. He drew a slow breath until the world settled again. Cecily appeared astride a well-kept chestnut. Her body leaned with easy grace in the saddle, her dark riding habit of deep moss green falling in carefully judged folds. A dark hat shaded her pale braid. From a distance, any observer would see nothing but a respectable lady out for a ride. Up close, Gabriel saw what he was beginning to recognize as her signature, a firm tilt of the chin, an alert gaze, a steadiness no delicate gown could disguise. She had disobeyed. He had no doubt her father had forbidden her to leave the house for months, perhaps longer. And still she was here, in the same park, at nearly the same spot. Frustration and reluctant admiration moved through him in one uncomfortable wave. The woman was entirely too brave for her own safety. Cecily dismounted near the gate where the attack had taken place. She tied the reins to a low rail and glanced around, as if expecting someone. Moments later, a thin figure emerged from between the trees, a young man with a lined face, plain workman's clothes, and a distinct drag in his left leg. A veteran, Gabriel estimated. That kind of gait belonged to an old wound. High probability Crimea. They spoke in low tones. The distance blurred the words, but their bodies told the story. Cecily bent forward slightly, head tilted, as though every syllable the man uttered mattered. Then she drew a small envelope from her coat and pressed it into his hand. She touched his forearm, a quick, steady, fraternal gesture entirely improper in the eyes of society. The man nodded, visibly moved, and limped away toward the less fashionable edge of the park. She remained alone for a moment, watching him go. Her shoulders, so straight when she'd arrived, now seemed faintly bowed. There was a weariness in her posture, and something Gabriel knew far too well, the weight of carrying other people's pain simply because one could not bear to leave it where it lay. He had meant to stay in the shadows. Instead, he found himself stepping forward. "Lady Cecily." She turned so quickly she nearly caught her hem. Her hand flew to her chest. When she recognized him, her blue eyes widened, first in surprise, then with a flicker of alarm. "Your Grace!" The words came out louder than she intended. You You shouldn't be out of bed. I could say the same. Gabriel moved toward her at an unhurried pace, keeping a distance that would leave no space for gossip. Was your father not clear enough about staying home? Colour rose in her cheeks, visible even in the gentle morning light, yet her chin did not yield. I am not a child to be locked away at anyone's whim, she replied, controlled but firm. No. He studied her. Up close he saw the shadows beneath her eyes, the pallor, the faint tremor she hid by curling her fingers into her skirt. But you are someone who was nearly murdered less than a week ago. Coming back to the same place at the same hour? He tipped his head. Some would call it courage, others would call it recklessness. I haven't decided which yet. Courage, she retorted, almost automatically. Then her tone softened. Or desperation. There are people who depend on me, Your Grace. I can't simply vanish because someone decided I am inconvenient. Inconvenient? Gabriel repeated the word, dry bitterness in his voice. Is that what you call those who order your death? Her fingers tightened in the fabric, an involuntary giveaway. I don't know who it was. But you have ideas. It was not a question. He saw the answer in the set of her shoulders, in the heartbeat-long pause before she avoided his gaze. Perhaps, she admitted at last. There are those who strongly disapprove of what I do. People with enough power to make trouble if they wish. And what exactly is it that you do, Lady Cecily? She lifted her eyes, and he saw the struggle there, the trained instinct to remain silent, clashing with the same resolve that had brought her back to this place. I help those who have no one else, she said simply, maids with no defense, soldiers whom nobody visits, families turned out of their homes without just cause. If that were a crime, half the drawing rooms in London would be empty. It is not a crime. His voice came low, taut. But it does trouble those who prefer their dirt kept under the carpet, those who profit from silence. Surprise passed over her face, clear as day. So you understand. I fought in a war, Lady Cecily. Gabriel heard his own tone turn rougher than he meant it to. I watched men sent to die on muddy hillsides, heard screams swallowed by fog, smelled the sickly sweet of blood mixed with gunpowder. Later, I watched many of those same men rot in infirmaries, while the medals shone on the wrong chests. He drew a measured breath. Yes, I understand very well how the world treats the invisible. Her eyes darkened slightly, as if some new piece of understanding had settled between them. You were in Crimea, she said, not asking but stating. Yes. Before I inherited. A muscle jumped in his jaw. For a moment it looked as though he might say more. Then he reined it back like a man closing an old door. My past is not the issue here. The issue is that someone shot at you, and I am not in the habit of leaving a task half done. Do you mean keeping me alive or keeping me shut indoors? The spark of rebellion flashed again. Because staying locked in my house while people need help is not life, Your Grace. It's just another kind of death. It's survival, he cut in, perhaps more sharply than wisdom recommended. Courage without calculation is merely a prettier road to the grave. She drew a long breath, her chest rising slowly, as if she were taming the burning answers she wanted to give. When she spoke, her voice was cooler, more precise. Then what do you suggest? That I abandon everything I've built? That I pretend not to see what I see, just to soothe those who are comfortable with injustice? No, he held her gaze. I suggest you continue, but with protection, with strategy, with someone willing to confront, on your behalf, the kind of enemy who prefers to act from the shadows. And this someone would be me. The word fell between them without ornament. Simple. Final. Cecily blinked, honestly taken aback. Then slowly, surprise blended into something else. Cautious distrust, a fine thread of curiosity, and a hope so fragile it almost resembled fear. Why? The question slipped out barely above a whisper. Why do you care, Your Grace? You barely know me. Gabriel could have said gratitude, honor, propriety. All correct, all acceptable, all useless. None of them touched what truly moved him. Because I recognize someone who has been fighting alone for far too long, he said at last, with a candor he did not offer easily to anyone. And because no one should have to choose between doing what's right and staying alive. The silence that followed was not comfortable, but it was not hostile either. It was thick with unsaid things, with fears neither of them knew how to name. "Protection comes with a cost," she murmured at last. "And conditions." "What conditions?" "I will not stop." Her voice was a thin blade, quiet but unyielding. "I can change my routes, my hours. I can be more careful. But I will not abandon anyone. And if you expect me to obey you blindly, you have chosen the wrong woman." "I don't want your obedience, Cecily," he corrected himself at once. "Lady Cecily." One delicate brow arched, but she let the slip pass. "I want your cooperation," he went on, "and your honesty. If I'm to protect you, I need to know what we're facing. Every name, every case that met with resistance, any veiled threat, even those that seemed insignificant." "It will take time," she said, a faint, tired smile tugging at her mouth. "There are many names." "I have time." He paused. "And allies. Men who can keep watch from a distance without harming your reputation. There are already discreet eyes on your street. No one will approach without being seen." She blinked, startled. Perhaps because she hadn't noticed. Perhaps because she realized she had already been under guard without knowing it. "Trust doesn't come easily to me," she admitted. "Nor to me." Gabriel dipped his head slightly. "But if we're to work together, we'll have to risk a little. And if you'll allow me one presumption," her chin lifted wary. "Between us, when we're alone and speaking of these matters, I'd like you to call me Gabriel." He hesitated for a heartbeat, as though weighing his own boldness. Very few people do anymore. For a moment, Cecily looked honestly shocked. Then a brief, tentative smile softened her lips. "That is highly improper," she murmured. "Almost everything we're doing is," he replied, with a dry hint of humor that surprised them both. She lowered her eyes for a moment, as if measuring the line they were about to cross. When she looked back up, there was resolve in her gaze. "Very well," she said quietly. "Gabriel." His name sounded strange on her tongue, heavy, as though she were testing it for the first time. He felt a thin thread of heat move through his chest in a way he found annoyingly distinct. "Then you must call me Cecily," she added, almost in a whisper. "At least when we're speaking of things no one else must hear." He inclined his head, accepting the unspoken intimacy without comment. Here in this secluded corner of the park, among trees and shadows, breaking etiquette felt less like scandal and more like inevitability. "Very well, Cecily." Her name sounded different in his mouth, closer. "Let's begin at the beginning. Tell me about the first person you helped. Who was displeased by it?" She drew a deep breath, like someone opening a door kept locked for years. "It was a maid," she began, "in a baron's house, and what I did for her did not please the baron in the least, nor his wife." As she spoke, the sun lifted slowly over Hyde Park. London was waking, carriages in the distance, faint voices, the low murmur of a city sliding back into its routines as if nothing at all had changed. But there, between trees and filtered light, two figures stood motionless, weaving a quiet alliance no one knew existed. And Gabriel Fitzroy, Duke of Harrowford, listened to every word like an officer receiving a campaign report. Because whether he liked it or not, keeping Cecily alive was no longer just a matter of honor. It was his new war. Chapter 5. Shared Truths. Cecily had not meant to tell him everything. Not that morning. Not in the same park where she had almost died. Not to a man she had known until a few days ago, only from a distance. A flawless duke, a name murmured in drawing rooms as a synonym for reserve and rigid propriety. But there was something about Gabriel Fitzroy, in the way he listened quietly, without interrupting, without the faintest air of superiority, with that grave, almost military attention that loosened defenses she had thought unshakable. Perhaps it was the pain still etched into the lines of his face. Perhaps it was the absurd fact that he had thrown himself in front of a bullet for her. Or perhaps it was simply because, for the first time, someone was treating her as a capable adult, not as the sheltered daughter of an earl. By the time she realized, she was already speaking. She began with Sarah Hendricks, maid to Lady Worthington, dismissed without references after a false accusation of theft. She told him how she had found the girl almost penniless, almost hopeless, how she had pieced together the story in fragments under the weak light of a borrowed kitchen. She explained how, suspicious, she had feigned interest in the missing brooch and later found it among the belongings moved when Lady Worthington changed rooms. She spoke of the discreet solicitor who had used the right phrases and the right threats to persuade the lady to offer decent references. Gabriel listened with his brow faintly drawn. "Lady Worthington is kin to Viscount Craven," he remarked, thoughtful. "A man with very rigid ideas about everyone knowing their place. He goes on the list." A shiver slid down Cecily's spine. Not fear, not yet, but a clear awareness that this was becoming more than a collection of stories. It was turning into a map, an inquiry, a possible war. Then she spoke of Captain James Whitmore, a Crimean veteran left lame after saving 3 men, and still accused of negligence so they could deny him his rightful pension. The injustice had been so blatant that Cecily, furious, had sent the account to a journalist she trusted. The case had appeared in a modest but influential column, and Whitmore had finally received what was owed to him. "The colonel in charge," Cecily added, "sent me a note warning me not to tamper with the honor of men above suspicion." "Colonel Marcus Sutherland," Gabriel said at once. The name hardened his expression in a way Cecily had not seen before. "You know him?" she asked. "By reputation, and from the field," he replied. "He keeps company with men who served as sharpshooters." A short pause. "And he does not take kindly to being challenged in public. Least of all by a young lady." Cecily felt her blood cool by a degree. "Whitmore," Gabriel murmured, more to himself than to her. "He works for me now. I knew of the scandal, but I didn't know who was responsible for the reversal." His gaze found hers. "It seems you were already at my side before I ever realized it." A strange warmth rose to Cecily's face, a mixture of embarrassment and something that felt dangerously like pride. She went on, almost in a single breath. She spoke of the Thompson children, turned into the street by a greedy landlord when their father fell ill, of Dr. Henry Morrison, threatened with the loss of his respectable patients for treating the poor too often and at inconvenient hours, of families she had helped secure positions in small shops, of maids she had shielded from accusations far too convenient to be true. With every new name, Gabriel seemed to file away another invisible record. When Cecily's voice finally faltered, she realized she had lost track of time. The park remained calm, but inside her, a heavy inventory had shifted into new order. "It's so many," she whispered. "I didn't realize, not until I said it all at once." "Not all of them have reason to kill," Gabriel said, his tone calm, not condescending but analytical. "Some would be ashamed if they knew what they'd forced you to endure. Others are far too proud to bear being defied. And wounded pride, when mixed with money and influence, can be dangerous indeed." She folded her arms around herself, as if trying to hold everything in place. "Gabriel." His name came easier this time, almost natural. "What if all of this is my fault? What if by trying to protect them I've provoked someone to the point of—" The word murder would not come. It lodged in her throat, rough and hard. "Cecily." He stepped forward. He did not touch her, but his nearness was enough for her to feel the quiet heat of him, to catch the faint sense of horse, leather, and lingering ether. Doing what is right always disturbs those who prefer what is wrong. She lifted her gaze to his and held it. That was when he added in a lower voice, "Courage is not the absence of fear, it's acting in spite of it." For a heartbeat, all she did was breathe, turning the phrase over in her mind. "Acting in spite of fear," she repeated slowly. "Do you do that?" His dark eyes strayed for a moment, past the trees, toward a point she could not see. For the briefest instant, Cecily had the sense that he was no longer in Hyde Park at all, but somewhere else, under another sky. When he looked back at her, there was something raw and uneasy in his expression, a kind of honesty that seemed to cost him. "Since I came back from Crimea," he said quietly, "there are days when I fear I'm not worthy of the title I inherited by accident, others when I fear I may never be whole again." His hands curled for a second, as if tightening around an invisible rifle. "In both cases I go on because standing still would be worse." Cecily held her breath. What she felt was not pity. Pity diminished. It was recognition. He carried a weight no one saw, just as she did. "Thank you," she said at last, "for trusting me with that." "Mutual trust," he reminded her, with a softness rare in his voice. "That was our bargain." She managed a fragile smile, but it was real. "So, what do we do now?" "Now you go home before they send half a dozen men to drag you from the park," he replied, slipping back into soldier's pragmatism. "And I start working. I have loyal men, discreet contacts, military allies. We'll trace these names, these stories, and find out who is behind this. And when we do, what then?" The question came out quieter, carrying a fear she didn't try to hide. "We'll make sure they don't try again." The simple sentence carried something sharp, a promise from a man who knew exactly what a single shot could do. A shiver ran along Cecily's spine, not from fear of him, but from realizing how far he was willing to go. "Gabriel." "Yes?" She drew a steadying breath. "I'm asking you to be careful. I don't want you hurt again because of me." For a moment something gentle flickered across his features, almost tenderness, almost surprise, as if he were not used to anyone worrying about his skin, only his rank. Then he dipped his head. "And you, Cecily?" Her name came firm but quiet. "Be careful as well. I can't protect you if I don't know where you are." She nodded, her throat tight. He stepped back, turning toward his horse. Cecily watched him go, the straight line of his back despite the injured arm, the steady soldier's stride of a man long accustomed to ignoring pain, the discreet shadow of exhaustion beneath his eyes. A man made of strength and scars, duty and silence. A man who, for the first time, saw her not as an ornament, but as an equal. When he mounted and left the park, the fading rhythm of hooves sounded like the end of something, or perhaps the beginning. Cecily stayed where she was for a moment longer, arms still wrapped around herself, as if holding all the stories she had just handed over. Something had shifted between them that morning, something deep, dangerous, and inevitable, like two forces set on a collision course from the moment that first shot was fired in Hyde Park. Chapter 6. Between Duty and Desire. Gabriel spent the next 3 days buried in the sort of work that would have left any secretary hunched and groaning. He, however, did it all by his own hand. Captain James Whitmore, lame but still chief butler and steward of Harrowford House, set a quiet web in motion. Former soldiers who owed him favours, investigators used to moving through the less polished corners of London, informants scattered across clubs where respectable men drank too much and kept far fewer secrets than they believed. Reports arrived under cover of darkness, notes folded upon themselves, messages whispered at side doors, names spoken in low voices. Gabriel paid generously for every scrap of information and, back in his study, cross-checked dates, places, and connections with the care of a strategist. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. Colonel Marcus Sutherland stood out from the rest like an ink blot on clean paper. A bitter veteran with contacts in various regiments, access to men trained with rifles, and a reputation for settling disputes with methods no one mentioned at the dinner table. When Captain Whitmore's case went public, Sutherland hadn't only lost face, he'd lost money. The pensions he had denied had fed a private, silent income, murky contracts in which he quietly pocketed a portion. Cecily, without knowing it, had pulled the rug from beneath his feet. But he was not the only one with reason. Harold Blackstone, a landlord whose pride and purse had been wounded by Cecily's intervention on behalf of his poor tenants, kept ties with less reputable men in the East End, men who knew their way around knives and revolvers and asked few questions. Lady Worthington herself did not seem the sort to order a killing. Her husband, however, had a temper and a noted talent for holding grudges against anyone who threatened his wife's standing. There were also 2-3 lesser names that, taken together, formed an uncomfortable list of people with motive, means, and loose enough scruples not to flinch at something as extreme as murder. Gabriel recorded everything in a steady, decisive hand. Yet the more he uncovered, the more frustration gnawed at him. Finding those who might have ordered the shot was not the same as proving which one had done it. And without proof, nothing guaranteed Cecily was safe. The frustration took its toll in sleepless nights. They stretched too long, filled with piles of paper, thick coffee, and the relentless throb of his wounded shoulder. Langley had warned that pain would be a faithful companion for weeks. Gabriel almost welcomed it. Physical pain was known containable. What he did not know where to place was the tightness in his chest every time he pictured Cecily shut in at home, restless, stubborn, the sort of woman who might ignore every precaution for the sake of a cause that did not know how to retreat. On the third night, when the candle had burned down to a stump and dawn was only a pale hint behind the curtains, someone cleared his throat at the door. "Your Grace!" Whitmore's deep voice was enough to pull him back. Gabriel pushed himself up from the leather arm of the chair and only then realized he had fallen asleep over the documents. The movement sent a sharp jolt through his shoulder. "What time is it?" he asked, rubbing his face. "Shortly after 6. Whitmore's uneven step broke the silence as he crossed the room, leaning lightly on his good leg. He carried a tray with tea and toast, which he set on the corner of the desk with his usual efficiency. "And with all due respect, Your Grace, this has to stop." "What exactly?" The question came out more curt than Gabriel intended. "This pace." The former captain kept his tone respectful, but firm. "You're not sleeping, barely eating, and insisting on using that arm before it's ready. You're tearing yourself apart over a young lady who, until a few days ago, was nearly a stranger." "She is not a stranger." The words slipped out before passing through any filter. Whitmore's grizzled brow rose. "No?" Gabriel dropped his gaze to the papers, as though he could hide the truth among names and dates. No, Cecily was no longer a stranger. Not after seeing her on her knees, blood on her hands, refusing to leave him in the park. Not after hearing her confess with a trembling voice that she might have pushed someone too far trying to protect others. Not after recognizing in her a stubborn solitude born from a different but equally cruel battleground. "I know her well enough to know she does not deserve to die for doing what is right," he said at last. "And I know you well enough to know you can't protect anyone when you're on the verge of collapsing," Whitmore countered, unmoved. "If you want to keep her alive, you need to stay on your feet first." Gabriel opened his mouth to argue, but a treacherous yawn cut him off. His sight was slightly blurred. His shoulder burned more sharply than he remembered. "A few hours' sleep," Whitmore pressed. "The rest can wait until midday. If anything urgent comes, I'll wake you myself." Gabriel knew when he was outmaneuvered. He nodded, reluctant. "Midday," he conceded. When he woke, light poured into the room with almost insolent cheer. The clock marked nearly 12. For the first time in days, the pain in his shoulder had dulled to a heavy throb rather than the keen blade of the night before. He rose carefully, testing his range of motion. That was when he noticed the envelope on the bedside table, blue wax, the Grant crest. He broke the seal with his thumb. The handwriting inside was unmistakable, elegant, steady, with a slight rightward tilt. Cecily's hand. "Your Grace, I once more offer my thanks for your kindness and for your dedication in seeking to clarify what occurred in the park. I know you have taken trouble with inquiries on the matter, and I'm more grateful than convention allows me to say. If your recovery permits, I should like to invite you to a small informal tea at our home tomorrow at 4 in the afternoon. My parents wish to renew their thanks in person. I confess, however, that I too am eager to know whether you have discovered anything I ought to be aware of. With sincere respect, Cecily Grant Gabriel read it once, then again. At first glance, the invitation was flawless, a formal gesture of gratitude from a family indebted to the man who had nearly died for their daughter. That last line, however, said what he already knew. Cecily would never be content with silent protection. She wanted to know. She wanted to take part. She wanted to act. He ought to refuse. Every visit, every public appearance at her side was fuel on the fire of gossip. London was already murmuring about the wounded Duke who had thrown himself before a bullet for an unmarried lady. Accepting fresh invitations to the Grant residence would only fan the speculation he had no wish to encourage. Thinking about refusing was one thing. Writing the refusal was quite another. The very thought of not seeing her, of relying solely on cold reports while she sat at home, eaten up by worry, tightened his chest with something that had nothing whatsoever to do with reason. He needed to see that she was well, that she was still sleeping at night, that there was not too much fear in her eyes, or worse, a kind of desperation that might drive her into some reckless choice. And truth he preferred to bury deep. He simply wanted to be near her again. He reached for paper and pen. His reply was brief, courteous, unimpeachable by social standards. He thanked her for the honor, accepted the invitation, and mentioned that his physician considered his recovery advanced enough to allow short visits. When he finished, he rang for Whitmore. "Have this delivered to the Grant residence today." The butler took the envelope without comment, though his keen eyes missed nothing. Gabriel ignored the silent reading he felt there and turned back to the business of dressing. As the valet adjusted his waistcoat, a truth settled unwelcome at the back of his mind. He was drawing too close to Lady Cecily Grant. And, unlike so many battles he had fought, he was not entirely certain he wanted to win this one. The Grant residence in Mayfair did not flaunt garish wealth, but the quiet elegance of those who have nothing to prove. Pale stone, tall windows, well-chosen curtains, a front garden clipped with precise care. Gabriel arrived exactly on time, in a dark blue coat, grey waistcoat and immaculate shirt. His arm was no longer in a sling, though any sudden movement still sent a sharp protest through his shoulder. The Grant's butler, a dignified older man, led him to the drawing-room. Even before he entered, Gabriel heard them, the measured gravity of the Earl, the musical softness of Lady Elmsford, and, above both, a clear laugh he now recognized with disconcerting ease. When he was announced, all three turned. The Earl rose at once. Lady Elmsford inclined her head with grace. Cecily stood beside her mother. For a moment she was all he saw. A pale blue gown, modest lace, small pearls at her ears. Her hair was arranged simply, showing a touch more of her neck than fashion demanded. Her eyes, bright, intent, more serious than at balls and dinner parties, but lit with a spark he still could not quite name. "Oh, Your Grace." The Earl stepped forward, extending his hand. "It is an honor to receive you." "The honor is mine, my lord." Gabriel shook his hand with controlled firmness. "I trust I find your family in good health." The first exchanges followed the expected script. Questions about his shoulder, measured answers, remarks about the weather, a passing reference to the unfortunate incident in the park. Beneath the polished surface, however, another conversation seemed to unfold. The Earl weighed him like a ledger: character, intention, risk. Lady Elmsford spoke of gratitude, but her eyes betrayed the worry of a mother who sensed complications beyond a single act of heroism. Cecily, unusually quiet, watched him with an attention that seemed to pierce straight through porcelain cups and polite phrases. When talk brushed against the investigation, the air grew subtly heavier. "I am told," the Earl began, choosing his words with care, "that your Grace has taken pains to understand what happened. We are grateful for that as well." "I do what lies within my reach," Gabriel answered, keeping his tone neutral. "It is important to know whether there was deliberate intent and whether the threat remains." "Does it?" The question slipped from Cecily, soft but clear. He turned to her. In her face he saw the same stubbornness, the refusal to be treated as a child protected from the truth. "I am not certain yet," he replied, and made sure she knew the answer was meant for her. Lady Elmsford hurried to say the matter ought to be left in the hands of the authorities. The Earl, however, did not fully agree. "If someone of rank ordered this attack," he said gravely, "it will not be the Metropolitan Police who find the truth. Men with titles know how to hide behind other names. I have more faith in the efforts of someone who understands their game." It was praise and probing at once. Gabriel inclined his head slightly, accepting the comment without binding himself too far in front of Cecily's mother. He knew he would make no real progress with the parents present. He finished his tea, exchanged the last pleasantries, and politely indicated it was time he took his leave. "Allow me to see you to the hall, Your Grace," Cecily said. The Earl hesitated just long enough to weigh propriety against appearances. Then he nodded. In the hall, with the butler discreetly out of earshot, the tone shifted. "What have you truly discovered?" Cecily asked, straight to the point, her voice low and steady. "Not the fragments you can say in front of my parents. I want the truth." Gabriel studied her for a moment. The impulse to shield her from it always stirred, but there was an agreement between them he had no intention of breaking. "Colonel Marcus Sutherland stands at the center of almost everything," he said at last. "He has motive, means, and a temperament suited to this sort of thing. What I still lack is the proof that ties him directly to the shooter." She grew a shade paler. "And you are stirring him?" she asked. Carefully. One corner of his mouth lifted without humor. "Men like Sutherland don't usually threaten. They act. I'd rather know what he does when he believes no one is watching." "That's dangerous," she whispered. "Yes," he agreed, "but less dangerous than leaving him unchallenged." Cecily drew a long breath. "I have been following the precautions," she said. "I don't go out alone. My mother nearly bolts the windows. I'm slowly going mad, but I am alive." The delicate irony pulled a shadow of a smile from him. "Idleness never suited you," he observed. "Being an ornament never suited me," she corrected. "Knowing there are people in need while I sit and take tea embroidering flowers is unbearable." He understood that with a clarity he found bothersome. He, too, remembered dinners in London after the war, silver gleaming on white linen, while memories of his brother and muddy trenches haunted his sleep. "Then tell me who they are," he said, before he could think better of it. "The ones in greatest need now, while you're confined here. Give me names, situations. I can intervene." She stared at him as though she were not sure she had heard properly. "You would do that? If you allow it." He held her gaze. "I am no good with embroidery or flowers, but I know how to negotiate with landlords, face men who only respect force, and put fear where it is needed." A different light came into Cecily's eyes, not just gratitude, but a kind of relief that hurt Gabriel to see. How long had she been carrying all this alone? "Why?" she asked, almost in a whisper. It was a question he had been avoiding even in his own mind. Because he admired her courage, because he understood her anger, because, of all the silent burdens he carried, her defiance was one of the few that made sense. "Because it is right," he answered, choosing the portion of truth he could voice, "and because I cannot bear the thought of watching you stop out of fear." She was quiet for several seconds, eyes locked on his, as though trying to see past all his layers of reserve. At last, something in her seemed to give way. Cecily stepped the smallest fraction closer. She did not extend her hand. That would have been too bold in that hall, with servants possibly watching. But she leaned in just enough for only him to hear. "I'll send a list," she murmured. "Names and stories. If you can help them in my place." "I will do what I can," he promised. She straightened, rearranging the impeccable mask of a well-bred lady, but her eyes did nothing to hide what had just been sealed between them, the consolidation of an alliance that had outgrown simple gratitude or convenience. "Thank you," she said, stepping back, "for everything." Gabriel inclined his head in reply. He knew he had to leave before he said something he could not recall. When the door closed behind him and the carriage rolled forward, the thought came with uncomfortable clarity. Since the war, he had spent years building walls around himself, between duke and soldier, between duty and man. And in a matter of days, a young woman with blue eyes and reckless stubbornness had started to find the cracks in those walls. For the first time in a very long while, Gabriel was not entirely sure he wanted to repair them. Chapter 7. Silent Surrender. Cecily could not stop thinking about Gabriel. She had tried to sleep. She had counted in her head the steps on the grand staircase, lines of French verse, the distant tolling of church bells she knew by memory. Nothing worked. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Gabriel. And it was not merely gratitude. Gratitude she knew well, for the housekeeper who had comforted her as a child, for the friend who had kept her secrets, for the doctors who had tried to save her little sister. Gratitude was clear, defined, steady. What she felt for Gabriel was something else, deeper, more restless, more dangerous. It was the way he listened, truly listened, without cutting her off, without treating her like some impressionable girl, without offering easy solutions just to quiet her. And above all, it was the way he saw her, not only as Lady Cecily Grant, obedient daughter and darling of the season, but as a woman who fought in silence, who refused to look away, who carried far more than she allowed anyone to notice. In front of him, for the first time, Cecily had the unsettling feeling of not performing. She turned onto her side, hugging the pillow as if that could hold the storm inside her still. It was madness. It was reckless. Gabriel Fitzroy was a duke, a position that came with very clear expectations: advantageous marriage, faultless wife, a life without scandal. She, on the other hand, was already tangled in one, target of an attempt on her life, involved in causes many deemed unfit for a lady, now bound to him by rumors whispered in drawing rooms. Besides, he had never given her the smallest sign of courtship. Respect, yes. Trust, perhaps. Quiet admiration. But love? Cecily did not dare give that name to what she saw. Only that, in silence, she was already starting to do just that. Gabriel's note arrived 4 days later, carried by a maid Cecily recognized at once. One of the women she had helped before. Discreet, efficient, with the watchful eyes of someone who understood the value of silence. No one in the house paid much attention to the small folded paper tucked against the girl's apron. The note, with no formal seal, bore only an initial on the outside. Cecily unfolded it with impatient fingers. "See, I have visited Mrs. Alice Harper." The situation was worse than I imagined. Her employer was not only withholding wages, but threatening violence if she dared seek the authorities. I have already secured her a new position in a respectable household, with no ties to the former employer. She leaves tomorrow. The Thompson family has been relocated. Their former landlord is now under scrutiny for abuses committed against workers on other properties. His illegal eviction appears to be the least of his sins. Remain safe. I am seeing to the rest. Cecily folded the letter shut. It was not only what he had done, though knowing those people were now safer, loosened something tight in her chest. It was the simple fact that he had gone, that he had left his house, shoulder still healing, to visit maids, poor families, people on the edge of despair. That he had used his name, his resources, his time to carry on the work she had been forced to abandon. She pressed the letter to her heart, feeling the sting of tears that refused to fall. No one had ever done this for her. No one had ever understood so precisely the weight of what others called charity, as though it were a genteel pastime, when for Cecily it had always been a battle. How could she not fall in love with a man like that? The question arrived on its own, clear as glass. Cecily sucked in a breath. Fall in love, was that it? This braid of gratitude and admiration, and the irrational longing to see him walk through the door at any moment. This tightening in her chest at the sight of his handwriting, this recurring warmth when she remembered how his eyes darkened when he looked at her, as though he were measuring the world and by some miracle found her worthy. No, she whispered into the quiet room. It mustn't be. But the heart did not organize itself around must and must not. Deep down, however fiercely she fought the words, she knew the uncomfortable truth rising inside her, patient day after day. Yes, she was beginning to fall in love with Gabriel Fitzroy, slowly, inevitably, and she had not the faintest idea what to do with that. Her reply reached Gabriel that same evening. Whitmore laid the envelope on the desk with a simple, "Private correspondence, Your Grace," before withdrawing with practiced tact. They took care to use initials and avoid compromising names in their more delicate details. Even so, Gabriel knew that any letter was in itself a risk, and yet he could not imagine bringing this exchange to an end. He opened the paper with an annoyingly vivid mix of anticipation and fraying discipline. Dukes were not supposed to feel like 18-year-old boys opening dance cards. Gabriel, I cannot find words enough. To say only thank you feels almost an insult. In a few days, you have done what I had tried to do for weeks, perhaps months. You have given me peace where there was only anguish. There is a woman, Mrs. Ellen Thorne, widow with 3 small children. They are being turned out because the landlord has decided to sell the building. She works as a seamstress, but what she earns barely pays for bread. If there is any way to find lodging or better work for her, I would be in your debt. And I know I should not ask, but has there been any progress in the investigations? Any further news of Colonel Sutherland or the others? I miss the work, and I must confess I miss our conversations as well. There is a peculiar loneliness in being protected and isolated at the same time. I hope your recovery continues to advance. With sincere affection, Cecily Gabriel stopped at the last line, with sincere affection. It was an acceptable phrase, perfectly proper for a young lady writing to a benefactor. Even so, that choice of word, affection instead of respect or gratitude, strengthened by sincere, opened a crack through which something far more dangerous could slip. Only then did he notice that he had been keeping all her letters in a particular drawer of his desk. That was not a habit he had with any other correspondent. He reached for fresh paper. The first lines came easily, assurance that he would assist Mrs. Thorne, a brief update on the inquiries, a mention of his shoulder improving. But when he reached the end, his pen faltered in the air. He wanted to say he missed their conversations too, that the nights felt shorter when he had a letter from her to reread. That in a way he did not fully understand. Writing to Cecily was the only time of day he did not feel entirely broken. He could not, or could he? His hand, as though deciding without him, wrote, "I too miss your words." As soon as the ink dried, guilt came. Too intimate, too revealing. A sentence which, in the wrong eyes, might be read as a promise he had no right to make. For a moment, Gabriel considered tearing it up and starting anew. Instead, he thought of what Cecily herself had written about the loneliness of being protected and shut away, thought of how little genuine companionship her world allowed. He folded the letter, sealed the envelope, and sent it. The days that followed fell into a strange rhythm, one that for them both was dangerously easy to grow used to. By day, Gabriel divided himself between 2 fronts. On one side, the tightening net around Sutherland and the other suspects. On the other, the list of names Cecily sent him, Mrs. Thorne, another forgotten veteran, a maid threatened with slander, a family on the edge of eviction. He negotiated with landlords, used the weight of his title sparingly but effectively, and placed fear in the right corners. At night, the letters went back and forth. What had begun as an exchange of reports slowly became something far more personal. Cecily wrote about confinement, about the feeling of being a bird in a gilded cage. Gabriel answered with dry remarks about the absurdity of certain social rules, more than he would ever dare say aloud in a drawing-room. She spoke of the sister she had lost to scarlet fever. He wrote, with a painful economy of words, about the elder brother who would never live to be duke. Both knew all too well the taste of guilt for having survived. Hidden behind ink and paper, they allowed themselves to say what they would never have risked face to face. The distance of the page gave a curious kind of courage. No one saw the flush on their cheeks, the trembling of hands, the weighted silence between one line and the next. Something was growing there. Not all at once, but like a flame fed by every letter, every revelation, every confidence drawn from hearts trained to be discreet. Cecily knew. Gabriel knew. Neither dared name it. Not yet. It was in the 4th week that the fragile balance began to give way. One of Whitmore's informants, a man of few words and proven loyalty, brought what Gabriel had both expected and dreaded: record of a substantial payment from an account tied to Colonel Sutherland to an individual known, in certain carefully guarded circles, as a distance problem solver. The date 2 days before the attack in Hyde Park. It was not evidence for a court, but it was more than enough for a confrontation. Gabriel knew how to deal with men like Sutherland. A meeting with the right witnesses present, a well-crafted threat of exposure, a pointed mention of the appropriate newspapers, and the old colonel would understand that a second attempt would not only fail, It would drag his name through very public mud. He sent word to Cecily. He could not write everything. Paper had the inconvenient habit of outliving secrets, but he asked in careful lines that they meet in the back garden of the Grant residence at a time when her parents would be distracted with calls and a trusted maid could watch the gallery door. It was unwise. It was dangerous. And still he saw no other way to tell her what he needed to tell her while looking into her eyes. The Grants' garden, walled with ivy-clad stone and shielded from the street, felt like another world compared to the formal facades of Mayfair. Among clipped shrubs and ordered flower beds lay small corners where conversations could occur beyond the house's hearing. Cecily waited in one of them when Gabriel slipped in through the side gate the butler had indicated. She wore a simple lavender gown, lightly trimmed. Her hair was gathered more loosely than at formal events, a few strands escaping to soften her face. A trusted maid pretended to tend the flowers at a distance, a quiet sentinel. When Cecily saw him, her expression, a blend of relief and anxiety, tightened something inside his chest. "Gabriel," she murmured, taking a small step toward him. "I received your letter. You've discovered something?" "Yes." He kept the distance prudence demanded, although every part of him seemed inclined otherwise. "I have evidence linking Sutherland to the man who fired the shot. Not enough for judges and verdicts, but enough to make him think twice before trying again." A wave of relief crossed her face, followed quickly by a shadow. "Then it is over?" she asked. "Almost." Gabriel chose his words with care. "I'm meeting him tomorrow. There will be witnesses, and I'll make it very clear that if he attempts anything further, it will not remain in the dark." She nodded slowly, her gaze drifting for a moment over the greenery. "And after that?" she asked, more quietly. "After I am safe, what happens then?" He understood what she did not quite say. "After that, do you go back to being the untouchable Duke, and I become once more the lady who says thank you and disappears?" "I don't know," he answered, more honestly than caution advised. "I haven't thought beyond keeping them from shooting at you again." She drew a steady breath. When her eyes met his again, there was more than curiosity in them. "I don't want it to end," she confessed, barely above a whisper. "This," she gestured faintly between them. "The letters, the work, the conversations. I don't want to go back to being only what I was before. A polished figure for ballrooms, waiting for a future I never chose." Gabriel knew very well what he was supposed to say. That all of this had been an exception, born of dangerous circumstances. That, for her own good, they ought to return to their appointed roles. But a lie would be cruelty. "Neither do I," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "It has been a long time since I felt this." "This what?" Her gaze held his, unflinching. "A sense of purpose that doesn't come only from duty." He lifted one hand helplessly. "The feeling of being connected to someone, not by title, not by expectation, by choice." The tears Cecily had been holding back finally slipped free, quiet, without sobs. "I'm not asking for promises," she said. "I'm not that naive. I know what society expects of a man like you. I know what they expect of me." She swallowed. "I only don't want it all to vanish, as though it never existed." He stepped closer. He should not touch her. He knew it. And yet his hand rose anyway, driven by an impulse years of discipline had not entirely killed. His fingertips brushed her cheek, catching a tear. "It won't vanish," he murmured. "Not from here." He touched his temple lightly. "Or from here." His eyes dropped for an instant to his chest. Cecily leaned, almost imperceptibly, into his hand. The scent of lavender and jasmine wrapped around him with an intimacy that made him faintly dizzy. For a suspended moment they stood like that, too close to be merely acquaintances, too far for a true embrace. A fine, perilous line lay between what they were doing and what they might do. "You need to go," he said at last with obvious effort, "before someone notices you're missing." "Yes?" She wiped the tears away and summoned back the poise of the lady the world knew. But something had changed in her eyes. A fragile, newly born hope that moved him and unnerved him in equal measure. As he turned to leave, her voice stopped him. "Gabriel?" He looked back. "Please be careful tomorrow. Colonel Sutherland is not a man to accept humiliation easily." One corner of his mouth lifted without a trace of amusement. "I know that very well," he replied, "but don't worry. I still remember how to deal with dangerous men." "Even so," she insisted, her voice catching a little. "Be careful. I couldn't bear it if—" She broke off, biting her lip, as if she'd gone too far. She did not need to finish. "I'll be careful," he promised more solemnly, "for you." When he slipped through the side gate and back into the city, his heart was beating with a rhythm that owed nothing to physical exertion. Outside, London went on with its carts, carriages, and conversations. Inside, Gabriel knew he had crossed an invisible line. It had not been a kiss, nor any grand declaration. It was something subtler and perhaps more final, admitting quietly that he did not wish to return to what he had been before. He realized with a clarity that hurt that he had been surrendering for weeks without noticing it, letter by letter, glance by glance, secret by secret. And that surrender, silent, inevitable, frightened him more than any bullet ever had. Chapter 8. Confession at the Threshold. Gabriel chose White's with the precision of a general who knew every inch of his battlefield. He arrived at a calculated hour, just enough gentlemen present to guarantee witnesses, few enough to avoid the kind of attention that turned respectable men into gossip columns. The thick smell of cigars, the amber shine in crystal glasses, the muffled hum of conversations created a cloak of normality, perfect cover for what was about to happen. Marcus Sutherland sat in his usual place by the unlit fireplace, brandy in hand, posture as rigid as if he were still on military inspection. When Gabriel approached, he caught a flash of surprise in the colonel's eyes, quick but unmistakable. "Your Grace." Sutherland did not rise. The gesture was calculated, polite enough not to offend, defiant enough to provoke. "I came to see you," Gabriel said, his voice low but steady. "We have unfinished business." The colonel stood slowly. He led Gabriel down a narrow corridor to one of the private rooms, where secrets and disputes were given room to breathe. The door shut behind them with a heavy click. "Well?" Sutherland asked, bracing his hands against the table. "What do you want?" "To speak about the man who tried to kill Lady Cecily Grant," Gabriel replied without preamble, "and about the payment taken from funds under your control 2 days before the attack." The silence thickened. The colonel's fingers, yellowed by nicotine, tightened on the wood. A muscle jumped in his jaw. "A serious accusation," he said, in a tone that aimed for calm and missed. "I trust you're not relying on servants' gossip. I'm relying on documents." Gabriel stepped closer by an inch. "Signatures, dates, addresses, and on the fact that the shooter fled to a lodging house financed by a man who has owed you favors since Crimea." Sutherland narrowed his eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You've grown very fond of not knowing," Gabriel shot back, "but London may have to know, if I decide it should." Now the colonel straightened. The civil mask cracked, revealing the real face beneath. Cold, sour, dangerous. "Are you threatening me, Harrowford?" "I'm offering you choices." The tension between them all but hummed in the air. "Lady Cecily did nothing more than expose an injustice," Gabriel went on. "You denied pensions that belonged to men who bled in Crimea, and when a young woman dared to bring that to light, your answer was to send someone to silence her. She had no right to interfere." The colonel's voice hardened. "Drawing-room girls don't understand the real world." "She understands it better than you," Gabriel replied ice-cold. "And the real world today demands that you answer for what you did." Sutherland took a step forward, bringing them within mere inches. "Be careful, Duke," he hissed. "Titles aren't armor, accidents happen." Gabriel did not move. "If anything happens to me, to Cecily, or to anyone tied to this matter," he said very calmly, "half the newspapers in London will receive sealed documents linking you to the attempt. They may not be enough for a judge, but they'll be enough to drag your reputation through the mud." And clubs like this will shut their doors in your face faster than you can blink. A little colour drained from Sutherland's cheeks. You wouldn't dare. For her, I would. The Colonel was the first to look away. What do you want? He growled. You will stay away from Lady Cecily Grant, and you will write a confession stating that you authorized an extreme measure against her. No need for names, only enough that should I ever use that letter it will ruin you. That's blackmail. Call it what you like. I call it protection. Sutherland stood motionless for several seconds. At last he let out a sharp breath between his teeth. You'll have your letter. By tomorrow at noon. Gabriel left the room with measured strides, though his heart still beat at a battle tempo. In the main hall he nodded to acquaintances, avoiding conversation. Outside, the cold air cut his skin like a blessing. It was done, and for the first time in days his thoughts ran to Cecily, not to the danger but to what might lie beyond it. Cecily was at the window when the dark blue carriage appeared. Late afternoon light gilded the street, but it was the Harrowford crest that sent her pulse racing. He was here. She descended the stairs as quickly as dignity allowed. Parsons opened the front door just as Gabriel stepped in, bringing with him the chill air, his usual gravity, and something else. Something urgent. "Your Grace," Parsons began, taken aback. "We weren't I must speak with Lady Cecily," Gabriel said, "on a matter directly concerning her safety." "I'm here." They moved to the drawing room. Cecily lit a candle to chase away the early dusk. When she turned back, she found Gabriel standing in the center of the rug, as rigid as he'd been on that morning in Hyde Park. "Gabriel," she murmured, "has something happened?" "Yes." He took a step toward her. "Sutherland has been confronted. I have enough to keep him under control." "He won't touch you again." The relief hit so hard she had to rest a hand on the back of a chair to steady herself. "Then it's over," she breathed. "As far as he's concerned, yes." She drew in a long, shaky breath. "Thank you, for everything you've done, for—" "No." The word came sharp, strained. "I won't have you believe I did this merely out of duty." Cecily blinked. "Then, why?" she asked. Gabriel seemed to gather himself, collapsing years of pride into a single fragile moment. "Because I can't imagine going back to what I was before," he said, swallowing hard. "They say a duke should be stone, cold, untouchable, and perhaps I was for a long time. Until you." The air between them seemed to hold its breath. "Since the park," he went on, "since that morning when I saw you risk your reputation and your life for strangers, something changed. I spent weeks trying to call it obligation, protection. It wasn't." Cecily felt her heart tremble. "Gabriel, I've thought of you every day," he confessed at last. "Not only whether you were safe, but what you were feeling, what you might say, what you would write. I've realized your letters are the only time of day when I don't feel torn in half between the Duke and the soldier." He raised his gaze to hers. For the first time since she'd known him, his eyes were completely unguarded. "I am in love with you, Cecily." Silence fell like a veil. She lifted a hand to her mouth, not to hide shock but to contain emotion. Her eyes stung. "Foolish man," she whispered. "You stare down corrupt colonels without blinking, but you can't see what's right in front of you." "What is—" "I'm in love with you too." She stepped closer. "I have been for weeks, and I was terrified you might never say anything like this." Gabriel's eyes closed for a heartbeat, as if her admission hurt by being too intense. He opened them again. "If I were to obey every rule—" "You won't," she said softly. "I'll speak to your father tomorrow, but—" He hesitated, and the world seemed to pause with him. "I want to ask for your hand now. Here, before any formalities." Her heart pounded so loudly, Cecily was sure he must hear it. She ought to ask for time to think, to remember society, prudence, the future. But all that came to mind was him, wounded, resolute, kind, flawed in ways that only made her more certain. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Gabriel, I accept." The smile that transformed his battle-worn face was nothing like the controlled expressions she'd seen at balls. It wasn't aristocratic or measured. It was pure, radiant joy. "May I?" he murmured. Cecily simply stepped that last fraction closer. The kiss began gently, like someone learning to touch something sacred. Then it deepened, surer, warmer, the urgency of two people who had been waiting without knowing they were waiting. When they parted, Gabriel rested his forehead against hers. "I'll speak to your father tomorrow." "He'll try to intimidate you," she said, still smiling through tears. "I've dealt with corrupt colonels," he replied. "I believe I can manage a worried earl." She laughed, a small, intimate sound that seemed to exist only for him. "We're going to scandalize London, you know." "I fear so," he admitted, "but we'll do it together." "Together," she echoed. A faint sound in the corridor, servants' footsteps, made them ease apart, slowly reclaiming the proper distance, but nothing could erase what had been said. When Gabriel left the Grant house, the night air felt different, lighter, sharper, alive. It wasn't the sense of victory he'd known on battlefields. It was something else, a promise, and for the first time in many years, the future did not feel like duty. It felt like a choice. It felt like love. Chapter 9. Light after the storm. Cecily woke to golden light spilling through the curtains, and for a heartbeat she wondered if she had dreamed it all. Then she remembered. Gabriel in the hall, the rushed confession, the proposal, the yes that had left her lips without the slightest hesitation. She was engaged. Sitting up, heart racing, she almost laughed aloud. A soft knock at the door pulled her back to earth. "Come in." Mary entered with tea and toast. "Good morning, my lady." "Your mother asks that you join her after breakfast." "Oh, and a letter arrived." The maid's smile said everything. "From His Grace." The moment the door closed, Cecily broke the red seal. "My dearest Cecily, I did not sleep. I spent the whole night wondering if it was real. And it is. You said yes. I will speak to your father today. I know last night's proposal was rushed, but when it comes to you, I find prudence deserts me. Until then, always yours, Gabriel." She placed the letter in the drawer where she kept all the others, like relics, and went downstairs. Lady Elmsford sat in the drawing-room with her embroidery hoop, though the crooked stitches made it clear her thoughts were far away. When she saw Cecily, she set the work aside. "His Grace asked to see your father this morning," she said bluntly. "I imagine it isn't to discuss the weather." Cecily drew a steadying breath. "He asked for my hand yesterday, and I accepted." Her mother was silent for several long seconds. Cecily braced for lectures, scolding anything. Instead, a slow smile bloomed. "Do you love him?" she asked simply. "Yes." The word rose effortlessly. "And he said he loves me." Lady Elmsford nodded, as if something that had been out of place finally settled. "I saw the way he looked at you last evening," she said softly. "And the way you looked at him. I've spent years waiting to see that spark in you." She squeezed Cecily's hand gently. "If this is what you feel, I won't be the one to say it's too soon." The tears came fast. Cecily bent and hugged her mother tightly. "Promise me one thing," Lady Elmsford whispered, "that you will be happy. Everything else can be sorted." Gabriel arrived at precisely 10 o'clock. From the top of the staircase, Cecily watched Parsons lead him to the Earl's study. The door closed. She stood there in the hallway, pulse loud in her ears, catching only faint murmurs from behind the wood. When the door finally opened, Gabriel stepped out first. The moment he saw her at the landing, his smile answered the question she hadn't yet dared to ask. She descended halfway. "Well?" she breathed. "Your father was far kinder than I deserve," he said quietly. "He gave me his blessing." The Earl, emerging behind him, cleared his throat. "And he is aware that if he hurts you, not even a ducal title will shield him," he added matter of fact. "A condition I intend to honor with ease, my lord," Gabriel replied. Cecily all but flew down the rest of the stairs, holding out her hands. He took them instantly. "Then it's settled," she whispered. "We're getting married. Unless daylight made you change your mind." "I didn't," she promised, "and I won't." The engagement appeared in the Times in a handful of formal lines. The conversations, however, were anything but discreet. Some called it too sudden. Others sighed over the romance of a duke who had thrown himself in front of a bullet for his future bride. Cecily paid little attention, Between dress fittings and guest lists, she still made time to hear the reports Gabriel brought. Veterans helped, maids relocated, families settled in safer homes. The work had not stopped. With him, it grew stronger. 3 weeks before the wedding, a letter arrived that made her sink onto the nearest chair. "My lady, I learned of your engagement from the papers. Forgive me if it is improper to write, but I couldn't help it. When nothing was left, you and then His Grace helped me. Today my children have a roof and food. My youngest is better thanks to the doctor you sent. To know the lady who saved us will marry the man who saved her feels right. Two saviors finding one another. May you be very happy." With gratitude, Ellen Thorne Cecily folded the letter gently and placed it with Gabriel's. It felt like a quiet blessing, proof that their union was not just society's romance, but a partnership with purpose. The day before the wedding, another parcel arrived, from Harrowford. Inside, a blue-bound book filled with blank pages, and a note. "Cecily, this book is for us, to record every person we help, every injustice we manage to ease. When we doubt ourselves, we can open it and remember why we began. Tomorrow the world will call you Duchess. To me, you will always be the woman who refused to look away. I love you for that. Until the altar, Gabriel." She hugged the book to her heart. It was worth more than any jewel. The wedding on a clear September morning felt less like a spectacle and more like a path being walked. Her gown was white silk, simple, elegant. Her hair gathered beneath a light veil. Her arm looped through her father's, the church doors opening, and there at the front, Gabriel. He didn't smile widely, but his eyes said everything. When her father placed her hand in his, the pressure was steady, grounding. The vows were spoken clearly. No flowery declarations, only certainty in each "I do." There was no kiss before the congregation, only the touch of hands and a long, unbroken look that made Cecily forget the murmur of the pews around them. They left the church beneath falling petals, soft applause and delighted sighs. The reception was loud and glittering as expected. They moved through it together, offering smiles outward and sharing quiet glances inward. By the time the carriage carried them to Harrowford House, dusk was settling over the city. At the door, Gabriel paused for a heartbeat. "They say it brings luck for the groom to carry the bride across the threshold," he said, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "Shall we test it? Will your shoulder manage? For you, it will." He lifted her easily, and Cecily laughed, an unguarded sound that echoed softly through the entrance hall. "Welcome to your home," he said once he set her down. Then lower, "Welcome to our home." She glanced around only briefly before turning fully to him. "Home is wherever you are," she whispered. The kiss that followed had no audience, no etiquette, only the truth of what they had endured and chosen. When they parted, breathless, Gabriel rested his forehead against hers. "I won't promise it will be easy," he murmured. "I have my ghosts. You have yours." "I'm not asking for perfection," Cecily replied. "Just someone who stays. Someone who fights beside me. In that case, my lady," he said, a glint warming his eyes, "you've chosen well." She laughed softly. "We have a blank book waiting," she reminded, "and a whole city that would rather not be seen." "Then let's begin," Gabriel said, offering his arm. She took it. Together they crossed the hall and vanished up the stairs. Outside, London rattled on, loud, indifferent. Inside, two hearts were learning, for the first time, what it meant to share the weight of the world without feeling crushed. Not because the world had grown lighter, but because, finally, neither of them carried it alone. Epilogue. London, 1863, 2 years later. Golden morning light filtered through the lace curtains, scattering soft reflections across the bedroom Cecily and Gabriel had called home since the day they married. Cecily woke slowly, wrapped in the warmth of the sheets and in a peace she had once believed was not meant for her. The space beside her was empty. Before she could miss him, steady, familiar footsteps approached down the hallway. Gabriel entered carrying a tray with tea, toast, and the blue-bound book, the same one he had given her on the eve of their wedding, when it had been little more than a shy notebook, its pages nearly untouched. Now it was thick, heavy with entries, dates, names, and quiet victories written by two hands. "Good morning, wife," he said, wearing the smile that still stole her breath. "Good morning, husband." She sat up, watching him with a tenderness sharpened by time. Gabriel had changed, still carrying old shadows, yes, but no longer fighting them alone. The nightmares came sometimes, dragging him back to the muddy hills of Crimea, but they ended now with her arms around him. And that was enough. He opened the book to a page marked by a red ribbon. "We have a visitor today, Mrs. Ellen Thorne." His finger brushed the name with respect. "Her eldest has been accepted as a carpenter's apprentice. She wants to thank us in person." Cecily smiled with the warm delight she always felt whenever one of her people managed to start anew. "One more." "One more," he echoed, their private refrain since that forbidden morning in the park when they first made a list together. The foundation had grown far beyond anything they had imagined. 3 shelters fully functioning. Dr. Morrison now ran a small free clinic in East End, staffed with 2 permanent nurses. A modest legal office, quietly funded by Gabriel, defended workers facing unjust treatment. And that very week, Gabriel would present to Parliament a pioneering proposal to regulate the working conditions of apprentices. Critics abounded, particularly among men who preferred poverty to remain invisible. But there was growing respect too. Even some of the more conservative newspapers had begun expressing cautious approval of the Harrowfords' work. It was the kind of progress that demanded disciplined silence and constant courage. Cecily rested her head on his shoulder. "Sometimes I still think about that morning in Hyde Park." "So do I," Gabriel admitted, threading his fingers through hers. "I think about what would have happened if I had arrived seconds later." "But you didn't," she reminded him gently. "You arrived exactly when you needed to." He turned to look at her, the same intense gaze as 2 years before, but steadier now, more sure. A rare mix of strength and vulnerability. "Are you happy, Cecily?" She took a breath, because honesty was the foundation of the life they had built. Tired, often, impatient with Parliament on its worst days. She smiled. "But happy. Truly happy. I have you, I have purpose, and I have a life we made together, imperfect yet ours." "Perfect for us," he murmured, drawing her into a slow kiss, filled with quiet intimacy and a promise that needed no words. Later, sitting side by side, they revisited the Blue Book. Every name, every story, every life touched, even in small ways. Gabriel corrected a few of his own hurried notes. Cecily added details he always forgot. It was their ritual. And it was then, as she carefully wrote the next entry, that Cecily felt truth settle inside her, with the gentle clarity of someone finally understanding her own destiny. They might never change the entire world, but they would change someone's world, one person at a time. And that was vast, precious enough. Gabriel watched her in silence, the morning sun outlining her profile, and knew, with the same certainty that had filled him since the day he held her bleeding in his arms, he had not found an instant cure, nor perfect redemption, but something far rarer, true companionship, steady light after years of shadow. And that was everything.